The man sitting across from you at the banquet has been there for 3 months. He arrived quietly, presented his credentials, spoke the right language, wore the right clothes, said the right prayers at the right hours. He knew which topics to avoid and which ones to raise. He laughed at the right moments. He deferred to the right people. He built, slowly and patiently, the invisible architecture of trust that takes most men years to construct. He built it in 3 months, because he had been trained to. Tonight, somewhere between the 3rd and 4th course, he will complete the mission he was sent here to complete, with a blade small enough to hide in a sleeve. And then he will be gone, or he will be dead, because for the men who carried out these missions, death was not the worst possible outcome. Death was, in many cases, the expected one, the one they had been psychologically prepared for since the moment they entered the training that made them what they were. What they were had a name. The word entered the Arabic language, passed through the Crusader armies who encountered them and survived to tell the story, traveled into Italian, into French, into English, and arrived in the modern world stripped of almost everything that made it terrifying in its original context. That word is assassin. And the organization that produced them, the Nizari Ismaili state, led for decades by a man history remembers as the Old Man of the Mountain, was something that the medieval world had no adequate category for. Not an army, not a cult, not a political party, not a terrorist organization in any modern sense. Something older than all of those things, and in many ways more sophisticated. What Hassan I Sabah built in the mountains of Persia in the late 11th century was a weapon unlike anything his enemies had encountered. A weapon that could reach inside the most fortified palace, the most heavily guarded court, the most paranoid and protected mind in the Islamic world. And it worked. For nearly 2 centuries, it worked with a consistency that made the most powerful rulers of the age sleep poorly and trust no one. Stay with me. Because the closer you look at what the assassins actually were, not the legend, not the mythology, but the documented historical reality, the more disturbing and the more brilliant the picture becomes. To understand what the assassins were, you first have to understand the world they emerged from. The late 11th century Islamic world was fracturing. The Abbasid Caliphate, once the most powerful political and religious authority in the region, had been hollowing out for generations. Real power had migrated to the Seljuk Turks, a military dynasty that controlled vast territories, but whose legitimacy was contested by significant portions of the Muslim world. Underneath that contest ran a deeper fault line, the division between Sunni and Shia Islam that had been splitting communities, families, and political alliances since the 7th century. Into this fracture stepped Hassan I Sabah. Born in Persia around 1050 AD, Hassan was not a soldier. He was a scholar, a theologian, a man of extraordinary intellectual precision who had studied mathematics, astronomy, philosophy, and religious doctrine with the kind of total absorption that produces either saints or something far more dangerous. He became something far more dangerous. After years of travel and study, including a formative period in Fatimid Cairo, where he absorbed the Ismaili Shia doctrine that would become the ideological foundation of everything he built, Hassan returned to Persia with a plan. Not a military plan, something more patient, more architectural. He needed a base. In 1090 AD, Hassan I Sabah acquired the mountain fortress of Alamut in the Alborz range of northern Persia. The accounts of how he acquired it are themselves revealing. Not by siege, not by force, by infiltration, by the slow, careful conversion of people already inside the fortress until the moment came when the gates simply opened. It was a preview of everything that would follow. From Alamut, Hassan built what historians now describe as a state within states. A network of mountain fortresses scattered across Persia and Syria, connected not by roads or armies but by ideology, by communication, and by the extraordinary loyalty of people who had been trained to believe, completely without reservation, in the mission they were given. That loyalty was not accidental. It was engineered. Hassan understood something about human psychology that most rulers of his era had not articulated clearly. That the most powerful force in the world is not an army. It is a person who he spent decades learning how to produce that person. And what he produced changed the political geography of the medieval world. The legend says they were given paradise before the mission. Gardens behind hidden walls. Running water in a land where water was scarce. Music, food, rest. Everything a young man from a harsh mountain village had never experienced and could barely imagine. And then, after days or weeks inside that garden, they were brought back out. Told that what they had tasted was a preview. That completion of their mission was the door back in. Permanently. The legend was almost certainly exaggerated. Marco Polo repeated it. The Crusaders embellished it. Western chroniclers transformed it into something between a fairy tale and a horror story. But underneath the exaggeration lives a truth that is more disturbing than the legend itself. Hassan I-Sabbah didn't need gardens. What he had was more powerful than any physical paradise. He had doctrine. He had ideology. He had a theological framework so precisely constructed that the men who entered it emerged on the other side genuinely transformed. Not coerced, not drugged, not deceived, but convinced. Convinced at a level deep enough to override the most fundamental human instinct. The instinct to survive. The operatives produced by this system were called fadayin, those who sacrificed themselves. And what made them uniquely terrifying to their targets was not their skill with weapons, though that training was real and rigorous. It was their psychological profile. They could not be threatened. Every security system in the medieval world was built on a foundation of deterrence. Guards, walls, loyal retainers, food tasters, all of it designed to make the cost of an attempt so high that potential attackers would recalculate, would decide the price was too steep. The Fadayin had already paid the price in advance. In their own minds, they were already dead. The mission was simply the manner of it. This is what made rulers across the Islamic world, and eventually the Crusader states, genuinely, viscerally afraid in a way that conventional military threats never produced. An army you can see coming. An army has supply lines, morale, commanders who can be killed or bribed or negotiated with. An army needs to eat and sleep and go home eventually. A man who has already accepted his own death and who has spent months learning to be invisible inside your own court. That is something your walls cannot stop. Something your guards cannot identify until the moment it is too late to matter. The assassins killed caliphs, sultans, crusader lords, viziers, military commanders, men surrounded by the most elaborate protection their era could construct. They reached them anyway, not always, but often enough, consistently enough, that the possibility became a weapon in itself. Because once a ruler understood what the assassins were capable of, once the first dagger appeared where no dagger should have been able to reach, the fear became permanent. And permanent fear changes how power is exercised. That was the point. There is a moment that captures everything you need to know about the power the assassins held. In 1192, Conrad of Montferrat, the newly elected king of Jerusalem, one of the most consequential political figures in the Crusader world, was returning home through the streets of Tyre. He was surrounded by his retinue, in a city he controlled. On a street he had walked before, two men approached him. They had been living in the city for months, attending the same markets, praying at the same hours, building the same invisible architecture of normalcy that made them indistinguishable from anyone else on that street. Conrad of Montferrat was dead within minutes. He had been king for less than a week. The political shockwave from that single act rippled across the entire Crusader project in the Holy Land. Alliances fractured. Succession disputes erupted. The momentum of an entire military campaign was interrupted by two men with blades and months of patient preparation. That was the economy of it. That was what made the assassins not just dangerous but revolutionary as a political instrument. The resources required to field an army capable of defeating Conrad of Montferrat militarily would have been enormous. The resources required to place two trained operatives in his city were, by comparison, negligible. Maximum impact. Minimum investment. Hassan I-Sabbah had understood this equation from the beginning. He called it, according to some accounts, the doctrine of the Qiyamah, the idea that a small, absolutely committed group could reshape the world that larger, more conventional forces could only batter against from the outside. He was not wrong. But the impact of the assassins went beyond the specific targets they eliminated. The deeper effect was psychological, and it operated on an entire class of people simultaneously. Rulers across the medieval Islamic world and the Crusader states began changing how they lived. Meals became exercises in paranoia. Trusted advisors were viewed with new suspicion. The inner circles of courts, already complicated ecosystems of loyalty and ambition, became contaminated by a question that had no reliable answer. Which of these people is not who they say they are? There is no adequate defense against that question. You cannot build a wall around it. You cannot post enough guards, because the threat it describes is not external. It is already inside, already present, already eating at the table and sleeping under the same roof. Several rulers, including the powerful Seljuk Sultan Sanjar, reportedly received a chilling message from Hassan I Sabah himself, a dagger driven into the ground beside his bed while he slept. No es invisible. No guard disturbed, just the dagger and a note explaining that it could just as easily have been placed somewhere else. The Sultan reportedly paid tribute to Alamut for years afterward. The weapon had never needed to draw blood. The possibility of blood was enough. In 1256, something arrived at the gates of Alamut that no dagger could stop. The Mongols. Hulagu Khan, grandson of Genghis Khan and commander of the most devastatingly effective military force the medieval world had ever produced, had been moving west for years. City after city had fallen before him. Armies that had taken generations to build were destroyed in days. Civilizations that had existed for centuries were erased with a thoroughness that still staggers historians who study it. The assassins had survived by making themselves too dangerous to attack directly. The Mongols were not deterred by danger. Hulagu Khan had a specific personal interest in destroying the Nizari state. The assassins had reportedly attempted to reach him, had sent operatives into his orbit with the same patient methodology that had worked against so many other targets. For the first time in nearly 2 centuries, the method failed completely. The Mongols didn't change their commanders, didn't retreat behind walls, didn't negotiate or pay tribute or alter their behavior out of fear. They simply accelerated. When Alamut fell in 1256, after a siege that the last Grand Master of the Assassins ended by surrendering, apparently believing Hulagu Khan's promises of mercy that never materialized, it fell with a completeness that the fortress's architects had never anticipated. The library that Hassan I Sabah had spent decades building, manuscripts, astronomical records, theological texts, the accumulated intellectual output of one of the most remarkable minds of the medieval period, was destroyed. What the Mongols couldn't carry, they burned. What they couldn't burn, they pulled down stone by stone. The Syrian branch of the assassins survived for several more decades under Mamluk control, diminished and eventually absorbed. The network that had made rulers across 2 continents sleep badly at night was reduced, slowly, to a historical footnote, and then to a legend. And legends are dangerous things, because they simplify. They compress centuries of documented, complex, historically verifiable reality into images that are easier to carry but much harder to actually understand. The assassins of popular culture, the robed figures of video games, the shadowy operatives of conspiracy theories, bear almost no resemblance to what Hassan I Sabah actually built. What he built was not a gang of killers. It was a state, a theology, a psychological system sophisticated enough to produce human beings willing to walk into any court in the medieval world and complete a mission that most people cannot even imagine accepting. That sophistication deserves more than a legend. It deserves the discomfort of being looked at directly. Because what Hassan I Sabah understood about power, about fear, about the specific vulnerability that lives at the center of every system that depends on the loyalty of people it cannot fully control, did not die with Alamut. Those vulnerabilities still exist. In every institution, in every court, in every room where powerful people make decisions that affect everyone else and assume that their walls are high enough and their guards are loyal enough and their inner circle is trustworthy enough. The assassins proved, for nearly 2 centuries, that no wall is ever quite high enough, and that the most dangerous person in any room is always the one nobody thought to suspect.